Hey, what's going on, hobby family? Today I'll be showing you in-depth technique on how I like to remove nub marks and more when assembling your Gunpla. The way this is going to work is, I'll be breaking it down into the different but common scenarios you'll encounter and how you can deal with them. First, we'll review parts removal technique in 3 different methods depending on the tools you have at your disposal, and then we'll go over the rest. I'd recommend you have at least a nipper, hobby knife, and a good set of your choice of abrasives. If you're completely new and unsure what tools you might need, please see my previous video on essential tools, which you can click above or find in the tutorial section of my channel. Without further ado, let's get started. For the first method for parts removal, I will only have my regular nipper and a hobby knife. In this example, the nipper I'll be using is my Tamiya sharp pointed side cutter slim jaws type. My hobby knife of choice is of course the Tamiya modeler's knife with the standard oval blades. Good old Tamiya. Once I've identified the part I need, I will support the runner that contains the part with my left hand. Going in with my nipper, I will face the bottom of the cutting jaws away from the part in order to direct the force of cutting pressure away from the part's surface. The distance shouldn't be too close to the part either, somewhere halfway between the part and the runner at most, maybe even a little less, just don't be too close. Also, whenever possible, I like to cut from underneath the face of the runner. I don't know if this really makes a difference, but I try to do it anyway. My rationale is that sometimes when I'm not paying attention, I'll gouge or poke the visible surface accidentally, which will just create more work for me. It's also easier just to show on camera what actual part I'm cutting. You don't need to do this if you don't want to, but maintain that distance still on this first cut. Once you have those nippers positioned, go ahead and give a good squeeze and release, then pull away. Repeat this for the rest of the sprue connected to your part, but don't cut away that excess hanging off the part just yet. Wait until we've completely freed the part from the runner. Now that we have our part removed from the runner, go ahead and trim some of that excess off, but leave a very small amount behind. Also, if you get any plastic stuck on your nipper, make sure to brush that off before you do your next cuts. A good visual reference to note is where the smaller stem connects to the runner. That's right where you want to cut on this step. Notably, on this cut and on the following cuts, it doesn't really matter where your jaws are facing. Now at this stage, go ahead and start trimming smaller bits off the nub with your nippers a few sections at a time, but cut slowly. Finally, use the jaws of your nippers to cut the rest as flush as you can. But wait, we're not done yet. With your hobby knife that's loaded with a fresh blade, go in and gently chisel away any of that remaining plastic. Even after cutting with our nippers, there will always be that little bit remaining. When using your hobby knife, just try to get the cutting edge flush with the surface and just gently chisel back and forth. You might have to go at a very slight angle, but be careful. We don't want to gouge the plastic. Try not to rush so that you can do this safely. I'm used to using my left hand as a lock so the blade doesn't jab my finger. You can also do this on your cutting mat if that's more comfortable. Just try to cut away from your extremities and not overdo this. No need to draw blood. Yet. I have a vinyl glove on now as a first line of defense, but you can also wear an anti-cut glove if you really want some added protection just in case. It's also important that you take your time and really aim your cuts with a hobby knife, as we don't want to accidentally mar the surface or gouge the plastic. That's just creating more work for ourselves that we'll have to fix later with abrasives. Be intentional with each cut you make. Don't rush this. Put a podcast on, listen to some music, because you'll be here a while if you decide to do all the parts at once and want that kit built today. Keep in mind that it's okay to leave a little bit if you can't chisel all the nub off. It doesn't need to be perfect. I just want to emphasize that it's going to make sanding go by quicker. The important takeaway here is just to have the surface as flush as possible with no large steps or raised portions, as this will be trickier to sand away later. Once you're done chiseling with the hobby knife, you can take one more extra step and just gently scrape back and forth with your fingernail to get that surface just a bit more smooth. It's something I used to do, but find redundant. You'll see why later in the video. Anyways, repeat this for all the other nubs on the part, and you're good to go. I like to do these steps in batches depending on the size of projects and the volume of parts. This will be up to you in your workflow. Once you're done with that, hey, congratulations. You've just removed your first part using what I like to call the standard way. I'll get to sanding away the rest of the nub soon, but let's look at the 2 other ways you can remove parts. The next method requires that you have a standard nipper, a single bladed nipper, and your hobby knife. This method is pretty much the same as the standard way, but with a few nice shortcuts. Using my standard nipper first, go in and remove the part from the runner, leaving a good excess behind. Remember, on this first cut, direct the cutting force away from the part. A good way to remember this is to just face the flat part of the jaws away, so flat away. Now that our part is freed from the runner, this is when we'll take out our fancy premium single bladed nipper. You have a couple of choices here. You can either trim bits off at a time and then cut the nub off, or you can just cut right up against the part straight away. This is totally up to you. I usually just cut right up against the part, but here are some tips to make this more optimal. The cutting side of your nipper should always face the edge, away from the part's surface, towards the nub. The dull offset side of your nipper should always be off the edge of the part, aligned flush with the edge, or ever so slightly below the edge. This acts as a stop for the sharp edge and a guide for the cut. This way, we don't have to worry about the sharp-sided jaw of the nipper gouging the plastic. The advantage is that we can get an extremely close cut and save tons of time when we get to the sanding stage. Now, if you're unsure to where to aim your single-bladed nipper, you can always just cut perpendicular to where the nub sits just to be on the safe side, but it's not the most ideal. So keeping all these guidelines in mind, go ahead and make all your cuts. After trimming the nubs on your part down with a premium nipper, you should have very clean looking nubs that should be nearly flat with almost little to no excess plastic remaining. If you see any visible steps on the surface or any remaining excess, go in with your hobby knife and gently chisel that away as best you can. The more we take off before sanding, the faster it will go. We want that nub as flush as possible with the surface before moving on. Once you're at this stage, give yourself a pat on the back. That's how you remove parts using the 2-cut or 2-nipper technique. This is my preferred way as it saves me a lot of time. But what if you don't have any nippers at all? I highly recommend that you do, as it's going to make your life easier. But let's say you forgot your nippers and all you have is your hobby knife. True guerrilla warfare. A survivalist with nothing but their knife and wits in the plastic jungle. Well, we can still use that hobby knife to remove parts from the sprue and still get those parts ready for assembly. As always, I recommend starting a project with a fresh blade on your knife and change them as needed when you notice they start to dull out. Start by laying the necessary runner down on your cutting surface, ideally a cutting mat or thick piece of foam, and push your hobby knife through the smaller stems connecting your part to the runner. Same process, leave behind a little bit of excess plastic. You can also do this while holding the runner up too, but I think using a cutting mat is just safer. Cut away from your extremities and make sure your fingers aren't where that blade is traveling towards. Safety first. This is from experience. I have the numerous scars on my fingers to prove it. Anyways, once you have your part free, rinse and repeat. Gently and carefully try to chisel away that nub from your part using your hobby knife. Do a little bit at a time and go back and forth if you need to. Go slowly, and as always, be careful not to gouge the plastic. As a useful side note, it goes without saying, you should always follow the manual as you do this prep work and check to make sure you aren't cutting away a necessary peg. Occasionally, if you're not paying attention, you may mistake it for a nub mark, cut it away, and then you're gonna have a bad time. You can also do this while holding the part in your hands, but if you're not used to a hobby knife just yet, maybe try to use your cutting mat or piece of foam, as you're less likely to cut yourself. Another option is to wear an anti-cut glove to prevent slashing your fingers, if you decide to do it this way. Use the angle of your blade to your advantage as well. You can start cuts with the tip portion of your blade for more precision, and the wider and lower parts of your blade for more leverage. Think of it as bigger nub, use bigger part of the blade. Smaller nub, use the smaller part of your blade. It's a bit hard to illustrate in words, as this is something you'll have to get practice and a feel for as you do it a couple thousand times. Most likely you will, because after building a couple of models, especially larger kits with hundreds of parts, using your hobby knife with each nub will make you a master at handling one. So, if you have to resort to this method for whatever reason, that's how I would do it. I call it the I only have a hobby knife method, or Rambo style. So we've just went over all the different parts removal techniques and trimmed down our nubs. If you follow one of the methods and those steps up to this point, then you've already done the hard part. All we have to do now is go in with our abrasives and sand those nubs away. Now, I know a lot of modelers have their preferred brand, and there is an overwhelming amount of products out there available to use. So for consistency's sake for this demonstration, I'll only use a small diamond grit file, Tamiya sandpaper sheets, and Tamiya sanding sponge sheets. You'll be dealing with nubs in a variety of spots. They can be on flat surfaces, curved surfaces, in a tight spot, between features of the kit, on a weapon that's made of 2 halves, and the list keeps going on and on. A good rule of thumb is to remember that we only want to remove the nub and not pre-existing features and sculpt of the kit, unless it's a part you want to intentionally remove as part of your custom build or paint job. We essentially want to preserve areas that are supposed to be flat, curved, 2 halves of a piece, and so on. I like to stick to the consistency of the original design for the cleanup phase, and then see where you can take it from there. That's usually how I plan my builds. Most construction manuals or concept art will show you how parts are supposed to look if you're ever in doubt. So, we got our nicely trimmed parts, and now we're ready to sand away the remaining nub mark material. First thing you want to check is what type of surface that nub is sitting on. In this example, we're tackling a nub sitting on a flat surface. When you're removing a nub on a flat surface, generally you want to take care not to sand the nub at an angle, as we don't want to create bevels around our edges unless intentional. In this case, we want the surrounding area the same and just erase the nub mark as best we can. I'll start this process with a flat diamond grit needle file. You can however start with anything you like, as long as it's straight and rigid. We want consistent tension across the surface to plane away any raised nub material still left. I'd recommend starting with something rated at least 400 to 600 grit. Try not to go lower than 400, as you don't want anything too rough. This potentially creates deeper scratches and removes material faster, but it'll give us more work to do to correct that if you go too crazy. So with my file in my right hand and my part on my left, I'm going to align the top of the file holding it with my index finger, almost as if I'm pointing to where that nub is. I'm taking care to make sure it's pressed flat against the surface and not at any angle at all. With light pressure, file in one direction towards the nub mark. I'll repeat this process as much as needed and check the surface by rubbing my fingers or nail to feel for any bumps. We want that surface flat and that nub essentially planed away. You can also use scratches from the file you just created as visual indicators to see if you're going over that nub properly. Also, try not to change directions when filing by going perpendicular, as it might make it harder to erase. It's okay to go backwards and forward if you need to, just take care not to overdo it. Since the file is metal, we don't want to apply too much force, just light passes. Once you see that the scratches of the file have erased that nub, and it feels and looks like it's flush, stop. Obviously, you don't need to use a file for this. You can use sanding sticks, nail boards, or whatever you prefer, as long as it's rigid and won't bend. I recommend at least that. Essentially, it's the same techniques either way. If you need to grab a toothbrush to scrape away dust to see better, do that between passes. It helps immensely. Also, as a side note, this is much harder to see on pure white plastic, so you might need to turn the part and check the light reflecting on the plastic for clearer visual indicators. Anyways, now that we planed away any remaining nub material, this is where I like to go in with smoother, higher grit sandpaper. If you don't have a file, don't sweat it. Just skipping straight to sandpaper is fine too. Whatever is the most logical for you. Starting with a small piece of 400 grit Tamiya sandpaper that I've cut to about the size of my thumb, I'll fold it in half to give it some rigidity. Now I'm just going to go lightly over the areas that the file passed through, keeping some pressure and sanding somewhat in the same directions. I'll stop when I see I've gotten rid of the file scratches. After this, I'll repeat the process with 600 grit sandpaper, then repeat with 800, and follow with 1000, and then I'll usually stop around there. Also, if you see some plastic dust or some overhang from sanding sticks to the edge of your part, you can usually scrape that away with your fingernail or do light passes with your high grit sandpaper. Sometimes the friction from sanding will create overhang on the edges. Now, there aren't really any rules to this. If you feel like you could jump straight to 800 or 1000 after the file, or just skip the file altogether and go to 600, that's totally up to you. Keep in mind, the higher the grit or number, the softer and smoother the surface and sandpaper will feel and look. Depending on how good of a job on parts removal technique you do, you can skip sanding steps and save yourself some time. Those are just some great starting guidelines to keep with you as you're working through your kits. Everyone develops their own way of doing things. Do what's efficient for you. That being said, it's good practice to always check your work at each stage and make the right call. For me personally, most of my builds are full paint jobs, so I'm not too worried about scratches from sandpaper hitting areas where the nub wasn't precisely sitting at. As a side note, most clear top coats and primers with microfillers will cover up 800 to 1000 grit easily from my experience. When in doubt, primer coat will reveal anything I missed, but that's kind of a topic for another video. I do still try my best to be thorough, and as long as I go over with higher grits and not overdo it, I move on. However, if you're not painting and, for example, want to use the existing colored plastic to do your detailing straight over it, you might need to take more care of how you sand and how high of a grit to take it towards. For clear parts, like plane canopies, camera lenses, Gundam eyes, Zaku eyes, and so on, you'll probably want to keep going until it's polished glossy plastic to retain the clear glass-like effect. In that case, go to those super high grits and polish away. Go to as high of a grit as you need to go. You need to consider what your aesthetic goals are for your kits and how that surface looks to you. So try your best not to overthink it. And that's the basic concepts for surface prep in general. Now, the other common scenario for nub removal you'll frequently run into is when nub marks are sitting on a round or curved part. For example, pistons, cables, pipes, a Gundam or Zaku's head, leg armor, gun barrels, and so on. These can seem particularly tricky because there's that risk of oversanding the area around the nub mark, which can lead to flattening areas of a part you don't want to look flattened. This especially looks awkward if you're going to be joining that part with a connecting piece. But the solution is actually quite simple. You can use a file and sandpaper just like before. The only difference is that you just need to follow the contours of the piece while you're sanding away that nub. So instead of filing straight in one direction, plane the surface by following the shape of the piece. Sometimes you'll hear people calling this feathering it in. With this kind of scenario, you don't want to dig into the plastic much at all. Use very light pressure on your passes and check frequently. Move the part around if you need to make it more comfortable. You may also want to start with higher grits if you aren't comfortable with using the file, as it can remove material fast if you're a little heavy-handed. However, as a much easier alternative, you can skip the file and sandpaper altogether and just use soft back sanding sponges, as they're easier to use for this purpose. This is my current way of handling curved surfaces, as it's nearly foolproof. The soft spongy layer under the abrasive helps it conform to uneven or round surfaces and retain even pressure across the contours of the piece. This also makes it easier to handle, as all you need to do is give it pressure and drag it back and forth across the surface. Tamiya sanding sponge sheets are awesome for this. There's a wide selection from rough to finer grits, so this range of abrasives has you covered on that end. Brilliant stuff, really. You can find other sanding sponge products that also come in sanding stick form or smaller pieces, and may also vary in thicknesses or rigidity depending on the manufacturer. I prefer these sheets as I can just cut off what I need and easily see when I'm running low on a grit and need to restock my labeled baggies. There are exhausting amounts of options out there in the market. If you try something you like or have a different way of handling curved surfaces, please let me know in the comment section. I'd love to hear about it. Either way, it's the same process. Start as low as a grit as you need and move to higher grits while following the contours until that nub is erased or until you're satisfied with how that surface looks. As always, remember to check your parts between passes. Super easy, right? You'll be experts before you know it. So now I'd like to talk about a certain nub placement that I don't really see much modelers touch on. I sort of figured out on my own how to deal with this specific nub placement using what I know about the previously mentioned techniques and making some frustrating mistakes. So what is that scenario? I'm referring to when nubs are between two halves that make up a whole. More specifically, when you have two parts that join together to make one assembly. Examples include fuel tanks, armor panels, legs, arms, and most Gunpla weapons. In most scenarios, we tackle nub marks one part at a time. But for this example, let me show you why in some cases you might not want to do that. Take this long beam rifle from the high-grade Messer, for example. The main body of the gun is made up of two parts, kind of like a matchbook pair, but they're not perfectly matched. Not really. You can see on each of the parts, the nubs sit on the very edge of the part. If I were to sand the nubs off both of the parts individually and join them together, what tends to happen is you'll get differences in height on one side or both, which will create visible angles that make the seam line between them more obvious. This is caused by many things, like making different amount of passes or one side needing more sanding than the other. You get the picture. So now you have this visually jarring step or seam line there, and it's potentially got my assembly looking like a weird plastic sandwich. But what if I told you there was an easier way to deal with this and prevent this from happening altogether? First thing to always remember is that you should always follow and read through your construction manual as you build. When you get to a section where two parts make up a whole subassembly, look at reference images in the manual or online and determine if that seam line is supposed to be there or not. Basically, is it part of the original design or not? Or does it have a seam line there that is giving the impression of a panel line? Double check. If it's not supposed to be there and you don't see it in the example photos or art, well, then you have what I like to call a sandwich seam, commonly referred to as a seam line. Very common. To deal with the nubs on this and prevent issues, simply trim the nubs down with our parts removal technique as I described earlier and join them together. While the pair is assembled together tightly, you can now sand those nubs away. If they are loose fitting, just make sure to keep the parts aligned and squeeze them together as you sand away the nub marks. Depending on if the nubs are sitting on flat or curved surfaces, use the appropriate abrasives and techniques as described earlier in the video. If there are differences in each side, for example, one side being higher than the other, aka a step, go ahead and sand the surface nice and evenly so that the parts appear to join at the same height. By sanding them together, you're creating the impression of the assembly looking like one whole part instead of two individual parts pressed against each other. Nearly seamless. Nearly. Obviously, this will make welding the parts with plastic cement later easier too, because now you have a nearly matchbook pair. That seam line might still be visible to an extent, but for initial surface prep, that's good enough for now. There are ways to eliminate that seam line completely, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Now, if any other halves go over these halves, just repeat the same process. Temporarily assemble them over your parts, sand away the nubs, and plane away the surface if they aren't even. With this type of scenario, always work from the innermost sub-assemblies to the outermost if you need to. Kind of like building aircraft models. I always do this now as it prevents less headache and sanding work later. Super simple, right? Honestly, I never knew why I didn't pick up on this sooner. I was always doing it the other way and would always end up oversanding parts like these, ending up doing so much more work. Yeah, smooth brain moments. But that's how I figured this out. I wasn't afraid to fail, I just did the thing. So try it. I guarantee it will save you some time. You'll love to see it. Now, using what you'd know, the last scenario you may run into, especially if you're working on other model kits besides Gunpla or older Bandai kits, is the dreaded nub mark between molded features or super tight spots. I can't really offer one perfect nub removal solution, as they can vary differently on their placement. Sometimes your file or sanding sticks won't fit in those spots. This is where you need to get creative. Scrape with your hobby knife if you have to. Usually when I run into these, you can use the slimmest sanding sticks you have and work those nubs slowly away, a bit at a time. The tried and true way, and what I usually resort to, is just folding up some sandpaper super thin and try to work it in there. Like I said before, there aren't really any rules, just general guidelines and tips you can follow. Do your best, and don't be afraid to make some mistakes. Enjoy the process. So now, I've talked about pretty much all the common ways you'll be removing parts from the runners, and also the different scenarios for removing nub marks. There are, however, some other surface imperfections you will encounter, and that are from the molding process when kits are made from the factory, and may want to consider removing off your parts. Number one most common defect you'll run into is called a mold line. You might also see these referred to as parting lines or flashing. They essentially mean the same thing. These are usually hidden well on modern Bandai kits, but you'll still run into them in visible areas and might want to remove them. Runners are basically molded by two metal dies that are matchbook pairs sandwiched together. Plastic is then injected into the voids to mold the runners. As amazing as this engineering is, there will always be some trace of where those two halves joined, where plastic is very slightly oozed through and cured, and that's basically what mold lines are. They have the appearance of little raised lines of plastic running through your part, sometimes very subtle, sometimes very prominent. Thankfully, getting rid of them is pretty simple. You can start with your hobby knife if you're comfortable with using it, and just gently scrape away the mold line, tilting your blade at an angle, and then going in with sandpaper or sponges, moving up to higher grits as usual until your surface is smooth and free of visible mold lines. If you're not comfortable with using your hobby knife for this, you can just skip to sanding the mold lines away. It will just take a little more time. And that's really all there is to it. Other than mold lines, you'll occasionally run into the surfaces of your parts that are uneven and seem slightly sunken or have steps. You can usually find this because a peg is molded underneath and the plastic shrunk around it a bit during the molding process from quick changes in temperature. I like to call these dips, but there must be a more common term for it. Sinkholes, shrinking. Honestly, I have no idea. Another related surface defect you'll find is what's called marbling, also very common. Marbling is when a portion of a part is ever so slightly discolored for some reason, giving it a marble-like appearance. Usually it's not a big deal and you can leave it be, but in some cases, the surface may look uneven or have shrinking too. If you're going to be clear coating over raw plastic, you might want to get rid of the marbling as well, as there's a chance of it peeking through. Fortunately, defects like these slight dips on marbling can be easily remedied by, you guessed it, more sanding. Super simple, right? There's plenty of that to go around in this hobby. It never ends. You're gonna get so good at sanding. I love it, and I find it meditative. Anyways, now there's another surface defect that you may run into as well. This is what's called ejector pin marks. They look like little circular craters, or sometimes circular little mold lines. Sometimes they're minor and hidden. Sometimes they're pretty pronounced and obvious. These are also caused from the factory, from when pins are used to hold parts for stability to help eject them from the molding process. These aren't as common nowadays, and if you do run into them, they aren't usually in visible spots, so you usually don't need to worry about them, but occasionally you may run into them doing an older Bandai kit, or different model kit genre. Every manufacturer is different. Some are more severe than others. If they aren't too deep, you can just sand them away as usual. If they are pretty severe and in an obvious view, sometimes the only way to fix them is to fill them with some form of putty and paint over them, which again, isn't always an option for everyone at this stage, but just be aware that these exist and that's how you can deal with them. And that concludes this video, my fellow hobby people. I hope that this tutorial was informative, useful, and gave you a good idea of how to clean and prep your models for assembly, customization, and painting. These are obviously introductory topics, so for you folks that are wanting to see something along the lines of the more advanced, the Gunpla dark arts you say? No worries, I've got you covered. Each future video will tackle more advanced topics as we go along, and I'll be sharing everything I know, including the techniques I picked up and all the cool gadgets and stuff I like to use. If this information is useful for you and you'd like to see more of these topics going forward, please consider giving the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell to be informed of future updates. Thank you. Stay safe, be nice to each other, build stuff, paint stuff.